was not crazy. Neither was your sister, neither is your brother, neither are you. It's that house.
In January of 1856, upon realizing her escape attempt with her husband and 4 children would ultimately fail, an enslaved woman by the name of Margaret Garner killed one of her children and attempted to kill her 3 others before slave catchers subdued her. The popular narrative of her motives behind the infanticide was she saw life in slavery for her children as worse than death. The Cincinnati Gazette of the time described the event, "A slave mother murders her child rather than see it return to slavery." In the following weeks, she became the center of legal controversy over whether she could be tried as a murderer or tried as property under the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. The courts ultimately determined Garner's case was not a murder case, and she and her family remained enslaved. Garner never got to tell her own story. Contemporary newspapers spread the story of an unthinkable murder, and her life history was later taken up by an abolitionist by the name of Levi Coffin. But 131 years later, her story served as the inspiration for one of Toni Morrison's most well-known novels, Beloved. Beloved, as you might be familiar with from high school literature class, is a ghost story set in a post-Civil War Cincinnati centering on a formerly enslaved woman by the name of Setha, who's haunted by who she believes is the ghost of her daughter. Like Garner, Setha killed her 2-year-old daughter rather than allow her to be recaptured into slavery. But since then, the ghost of her daughter refused to leave, especially once Setha and her family became free persons. As an invisible force in the house, she shattered mirrors, trashed the kitchen, and even terrorized Setha's 2 sons away. In Beloved, the ghost of 124 Bluestone Road explicitly represents for Setha the horrors of the institution of slavery, which, despite her freedom from it by the start of the novel, continues to impact her relationships and structure her life. The ghost of Beloved is not just the woman who appears one day from the stream to their doorstep. It's also the house itself, and the lingering memories and traumas that remain with them. The novel opens with the passage, 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each put up with the spite in his own way, but by 1873, Setha and her daughter Denver were its only victims. The grandmother, Baby Suggs, was dead, and the sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away by the time they were 13 years old. Neither boy waited to see more, nor did they wait for one of the relief periods, the weeks, months even, when nothing was disturbed. No, each one fled at once, the moment the house committed what was for him the one insult not to be born or witnessed a second time. The residual traumas of the institution of slavery haunt both formerly enslaved people as well as their descendants, and each handles it differently. Baby Suggs is as nonchalant as possible. For her, her past had been like her present, intolerable. The trauma seems inevitable and unending, so there's a learned helplessness in even thinking of trying to fight it. For the sons, Howard and Bugler, the only solution is to run from the trauma and hope the haunting doesn't follow, though, as we'll see from some other ghost stories, that tends not to work. For Setha, this is the trauma that she's resigned herself to live with, and for Denver, this spiteful haunting becomes increasingly unacceptable as it drains more and more from her mother. Notable as the haunting is not consistent, there are periods of peace for the family, where it seems like the ghosts of the past might be gone, but they always come back to terrorize them once more. What ends up expelling the ghost of Beloved is the strength of community. Denver brings a community of other black women to exorcise the ghost, who assemble outside the house and sing. It's the support of the neighborhood women that helps to resolve some of the lingering trauma Beloved represents, which allows Denver to leave the confines of the house to work in the community. Through their support, Setha runs away from Beloved into the faces of the people out there, joining them and leaving Beloved behind, away from her to the pile of people out there. And this is juxtaposed with Setha reliving a traumatic flashback of her former slave master, triggered by the sight of an unrelated white man, whom she attacks in a panic. But even though the support of the community helps to facilitate her healing, prevents her misdirected attack, and allows her to eventually leave behind Beloved, traces of the ghost still remain. In the final chapter, amidst the repeated mantra that it was not a story to pass on, are lingering specters of that institutional trauma. Sometimes the photograph of a close friend or relative looked at too long shifts, and something more familiar than the deer face itself moves there. Even when resolved, as much as it is possible to do so, the footprints by the stream Beloved walked out of remain. Ghost stories are necessarily stories about the ways that the histories of the past continue to influence the present. As sociologist Avery Gordon articulates, The ghost is primarily a symptom of what is missing. It gives notice not only to itself, but also to what it represents. What it represents is usually a loss, sometimes of life, sometimes of a path not taken. In ghost stories, we see the fallout of the decisions of the past, whether they are personal, familial, or structural. We see the ways that despite our attempts to forget, the presence of the dead continue to be felt, to often tragic or disastrous consequences. Gordon uses the case of Margaret Garner and Beloved to illustrate her concept of the sociological ghost and haunting, which for her describes how that which appears to be not there is often a seething presence, acting on and often meddling with taken for granted realities. Sometimes this is explicit, as in the case of ghost stories centered on revenge for the misdeeds of the living, but sometimes this manifests in more abstract or metaphorical ways. It's no coincidence, for instance, that so many American ghost stories use the trope of the Native American burial ground, which, by the way, is a pretty racist and historically questionable trope. Pet Sematary, for instance, attributes its supernatural terror to the disturbance of such a burial ground. Here it's the histories of Native American genocides and settler colonialism that come back to haunt American families, and the destruction of sacred grounds to build hotels or houses or whatnot directly cause the ghostly haunting. It's also relevant that hauntings and ghost stories tend to be strongest at night, reflecting our tendencies to relive and agonize over our past mistakes when the world is too quiet to distract us, or the ways PTSD-induced nightmares intrude upon our rest. What keeps us awake can say much about what still haunts us. Through ghost stories, we can see how the memory of our loved ones, the sins of the past, and even forgotten events from centuries before us continue to shape the world we live in. Now, it's important to note that the ghosts we're talking about don't have to be literal ghosts here. A sociological ghost can be an individual, a location, or even a hidden past. Sorority Row, for example, is not a literal ghost story in the sense that there exists an actual ghost of the protagonist's sorority sister that's slowly murdering them, but it is framed as a ghost story. It's not a silly thought to wonder about whether or not the ghost of Megan is actually haunting the Theta Pi sisters involved in the initial prank-an, and it is thematically clear what the ghost story is saying when the only surviving protagonists are the two characters who were appalled at the initial idea to cover up a murder, and the younger sister of the victim who wasn't even involved in the prank. When at the end of the film it's revealed that someone is still out to hurt the remaining Theta Pi members, the message is clear. You can't escape your past. You can't ignore it. You can't clean it up. You can't pretend it's not here. You either confront it, often painfully literally, or it gets the better of you by maiming you with a flashy gardening tool. This metaphor got away from me. But confronting it once is not enough. Your history will continue to remain with you in some form or another. As a location, perhaps the most well-known site of ghostly hauntings are haunted houses. Most often, the haunting in houses are not initially connected with the actual family. Rather, new tenants find themselves embedded in landlocked histories that predate their arrival. Whether the case is a murder that has warped the space, unresolved abuse, or a history of institutional violence, it's the space itself that haunts. The fact that, for example, a plantation continues to exist is itself a ghostly remnant of a past that won't disappear no matter how much we try or even succeed in forgetting it. In many of these types of ghost stories, a family that moves into the space becomes warped themselves, showing us that we are embedded in the histories surrounding us. In both the first season of American Horror Story and the Netflix adaptation Haunting of Hill House, the families we follow find themselves as just the newest victims in a far longer story. Both Murder House and Hill House are houses that carry centuries of history that have shaped their walls and architecture, leaving walled-off cubbies and seemingly inaccessible rooms. The Winchester Mystery House, a real-life tourist attraction and legendary haunted house, reflects this as well, with its stairways to nowhere, doors to the sky, and seemingly nonsensical architecture that reflect complex social histories. But while these hauntings are centered on locations, in fiction they inevitably highlight familial hauntings that might otherwise go ignored. So Ben's infidelity, for example, plagues his relationship with his wife Vivian, and this structure is not only the core dysfunction of the Harmon family dynamic, but also the particular ways the house haunts them. Narratively, both the Rubber Man and the age-shifting Moira play directly into the central personal haunting that refuses to be buried, no matter how many times Ben or Vivian attempt to resolve the breach of trust and resulting fallout. This resolution only comes once the family's old selves have been killed, and they are offered a chance for redemption and happiness in death, themselves as ghostly memories that remain in the house. Haunting of Hill House 2 uses its haunted house to tell a distinctly personal story of the haunting of familial conflict. After the mysterious death of the matriarch Olivia, the Crane family dynamic breaks down over the trauma of both losing a family member and the ensuing high-profile court case. How each of the siblings and their father handled this fallout frames their respective episodes and the conflicts between each family member. Luke has become a drug addict, drowning his trauma in an escapism that has alienated him from much of his family. Nell is tormented by sleep paralysis and mental illness. Theo distances herself from other people because intimacy triggers that trauma. Stephen disassociates and denies, instead trying to move on through repackaging and re-narrativizing his family history. And Shirley literally paints over the past, and tries to hide her grief and trauma underneath the image of normalcy and perfection. In both these ghost stories, the ghosts are a backdrop for the kinds of personal and familial haunting that we can often find in our own lives. These ghosts are not so easy to leave behind. The bent-neck lady, the bowler hat man, and even the image of Ryan Quayle continue to haunt the Crane siblings far outside of the walls of the house. And what it takes to put at least some of these ghosts to rest is a concerted familial effort to come together, understand their collective and respective traumas, and support each other. As in Beloved, the exorcism of these ghosts is through community and support, and just like the novel, this exorcism is a healing path forward rather than a clean erasure of the past. But in many ways, the 2017 adventure game What Remains of Edith Finch is, to me, one of the most interesting examples of the ghost story genre in recent years. Really, this is all just an excuse to talk about Edith Finch. And by the way, the game was free on PS Plus for May of 2019, so you might already have it, in which case you should definitely play it. Finch, like Sorority Row, is not a literal ghost story. Though walking around the dark and deserted house often feels like a jump scare could come at any moment, there's no explicit horror or haunting in these walls. But like 124 Bluestone Road, Murder House, or Hill House, the house of the Finch family seems to take lives and push the legacies of unresolved histories to the forefront. In Finch, players follow the titular Edith Finch, who revisits for the first time in years her old family house. Having fled the house with her mother years earlier because of a family curse that slowly kills each Finch, she returns to find the house deserted but still teeming with evidence of the family's past lives. Each of the bedrooms had been sealed shut by Edith's mother and now serve almost as shrines. Toys, books, knickknacks, and pictures lay where they were left, and each of the rooms reflect the spirit of their former inhabitants. As Edith walks through her family house, she comes across journals, poems, and photographs documenting each of her relatives' last moments, sometimes through their own words and sometimes through the words of others. Still, other times what remains are not intentional memorials, but simply things they left behind. When Edith interacts with these objects, we get to see what's usually a first-person representation of their last moments. These stories are often not literal. We see Molly, a child who died young, turn herself into a cat, a bird, a shark, and then an eldritch horror. And we see a published comic book rendition of the mysterious death of Barbara, dramatized into pulp fiction. But what's meaningful about these stories is not just what's contained in the vignettes themselves, but how they form a larger tapestry of the family's history. Beginning from generations ago when her family lived in Norway, a family curse has allegedly been haunting and killing each family member one by one. Her great-great-grandfather Odin is even said to have immigrated to the United States to run away from the curse, a plan that ultimately fails as he dies in an accident that also destroys his house. The new house his daughter and extended family build looms over Odin's destroyed house, and the family graveyard they build beside it helps to remember and commemorate each fallen family member. But not all of the Finches are comfortable with this arrangement. Edith's mother Dawn, after witnessing both of her brothers and her father dying, decides to block off large sections of the house and later flees with her daughter Edith, hoping that ignorance of the family curse will end it. This proves ineffective, though, when the histories Edith doesn't know continue to haunt her. Eventually, even Dawn appears to agree, as she gives Edith the key to the family home in her will. For Edith's part, she wonders herself if it is a good idea to uncover some of the histories, when the knowledge might ultimately harm her or her unborn child. The central conflict between recognizing and trying to forget about history forms the basis of ghost stories. The refusal to acknowledge the past does not prevent it from influencing the present or the future. And ultimately, Dawn's escape from the house fails to end the family curse, but does result in the degradation of her relationship with her grandmother Edie. The histories of the Finch family remain, and whether locked up or sealed shut, find themselves influencing each successive Finch, even far away from the house. Ghost stories highlight the lasting impacts of the past on the present, and allow us to see how our own lives and our own institutions continue to bear the spectral traces of history. We can see the ghostly legacies of institutional slavery through its lasting impacts on the distribution of land and wealth in America, our education system, our politics, and even our prison system. Scholars like Michelle Alexander draw attention to how the structure of American mass incarceration functions eerily similarly to a system of chattel slavery, where primarily black and brown populations are policed, targeted, imprisoned, and then stripped of voting rights and forced into virtually free labor. George Lipschitz highlights the value of property as a source of maintaining and passing on wealth through whiteness, and how the history of who was allowed to own property and whose race inherently devalued property in the past still has measurable lasting impacts on wealth today. Like, for example, how public school funding through property taxes affords rich neighborhoods better education and consigns poorer, often racialized communities to poorer quality education and a school-to-prison pipeline. Structurally, we can think of haunting in the real world and how we conceptualize ghost towns, both in terms of historical sites that have become tourist attractions and also the ways we describe towns with empty factories and industries, where our younger generation's impetus to leave reflects histories of disinvestment in these communities. In literal ghost towns, the lack of people living there does not erase the physical impacts these towns have had on the landscape. Empty storefronts and remnants of houses show that people did once live there, and that impact continues to be felt. We still live with the ghost of Margaret Garner, whose death in 1858 to typhoid fever has not stopped her memory from inspiring paintings, operas, and poems. But it's not just the memory of her name that keeps the ghost of Garner around. Morrison's dedication of her novel to 60 million and more is just one of many ways the ghosts of those who died through the Atlantic slave trade continue to haunt our nation today. They live on through the tree on Setha's back, the last names of the descendants of enslaved people, and the institutions we live with today. A ghost story is a story about history, personal, familial, national, and how where we are today and where we go tomorrow is structured by who and what was there yesterday. What we can learn from these stories, then, is the value in confronting, learning, and healing from our own histories in pursuit of a brighter future.